I will tell you a story where once upon a time, once through a tunnel of time, once before time even happened, and I bet it'll even be happening when time is gone, there was a forest. And there are many great forests on this blue planet, and this was one of the fairest. And this is Sherwood Forest. Have you heard of Sherwood Forest?
Mm-hmm.
Sherwood Forest, everyone talks about it. You can still go there. Sherwood Forest is known. Now I would like to go to Sherwood Forest. Sherwood Forest has rocks this high and rocks this high, covered in velvet green moss. And that velvet green moss was so beautiful that many of the men that lived in Sherwood Forest, they decided to dress like the moss. They wore green tunics, green, oh my goodness, he has the ball, green armor. And this is partly a story about fair Sir Gawain, who wore all green armor. And he wore armor covered not only with leaves, but amongst the leaves there were faces of the green maiden, faces of the spirit of the forest. Now we knock it off. So, this story on this day is one of my favorites. It was a day like this, a day close to autumn, where every now and then, if you leaned in, you could smell wood smoke in the air. And every now and then, if you were really, I started out pretty well, but Maui, you're going to have to sit down. Sit down! And on this day, King Arthur was riding with his Knights of the Round Table. It wasn't too hot and it wasn't too cold. They were all on their horses. Their horses were sweaty and the steam was coming out of their noses, and their hooves, like pie plates, were pounding through the turf, and it echoed underneath the soil. And they were laughing and they would smash through the streams, and the spray was white in the sunlight, and they were laughing and joking with one another. And King Arthur was so filled with love in that moment that he brought his own horse to a slow stop, and the rest of them rode on, and you could hear them in the distance, laughing and pounding and jumping. And in that moment that sometimes we all take, he just decided to take it all in. And he took in the rays of sunshine that shot through the pine trees. And he took in the occasional yellow leaf that let go and glided to earth. And he took in the diamonds glinting on the streams. And he had a moment of gratitude for all that had become, and for the Knights of the Round Table, and for the efforts to bring goodness to this earth. And as he was gathering his horse up to turn and join the men, he smelled wood smoke. And he thought to himself, well, that's curious. We're rather far from the village. I wonder who's having a fire. I will go and see and perhaps make a new friend. So he turned his horse and he rode along the stream, and he saw the white smoke coming up off a small island in the middle of the stream. And looking at the sun in the sky, he realized he had plenty of time. He slid off his horse, tied his horse up where there was plenty to eat, slid into the water, and in his armor waded through the stream. And just as he stepped up onto the small island, boom! It's okay. A sword. It was scary, Taj. A sword landed right in front of him. And he got to his feet and got his bearings, and he looked up, and there in front of him was a black knight, all in black. Metal shoes, black leggings, black armor, black face covered, only 2 slits, all in black. And a muffled voice from behind the metal said, "Who comes here? This is my land." And King Arthur, always genteel, did in fact bow, but introduced himself as King Arthur and the king of all the land. And he said, "Sir, all are welcome here, if their graces are fair." "I don't have the pleasure. Who are you, sir?" And he said, "I am the Black Knight, and you are on my land, and therefore I have the right to behead you now. However, I am under an evil curse, because this is, in fact, a fairy tale." And he said, if you can return to me in 3 days upon your good word and tell me the answer to this riddle, I will be released, and so shall you. If you do not return, and King Arthur stopped him right there and said, I am always a man of my word, and given that I have stumbled into your predicament and your curse, and you are on my land in my forest, I will help you, and all the knights of the Round Table will help you. Simply tell me your dilemma, and we will see what we can do. Well, these soft words did not help the Black Knight. He pushed his sword further into the soil, and then pulled it out, and King Arthur backed up, and he said, I don't need your fair words, King Arthur. I need the answer to my riddle 3 days before sunset. And if you do not return, I shall spread throughout the land that you, in fact, fair sir, are not a man of your word. And if you are able to help me, the curse will be released on all of us. Are we agreed? King Arthur bowed, backed up and stepped off the island into the water, and waited as the sun set back over to his horse, who was waiting for him, untied his horse, and climbed back up onto his horse, and rode full of thought about what the Black Knight had presented to him. And what he had presented was an interesting query. The Black Knight had said to him, what is it women want most? What is it women want most in all the world? And even King Arthur himself had thought many, many a time with fair maids, and even with Guinevere, what do women want most in all the world? It's a mystery to me. And he thought about this as he rode through the paths of the forest, and the sun became an orange slit on the edge of the horizon, and he was lost in thought, and his horse found his way back to the palace, and across the drawbridge, and into the room where all the men were pouring wine and mead and making merry, and, as you know, eating large legs of chicken or turkey or some such thing. But they were laughing and talking, and King Arthur released his horse to one of his helpers, his helpmen, and went over, and instead of joining the men, and instead of having a cup of mead, lost in thought, he sank into the shadows by the great fire, where only the flickering flames lit the side of his troubled face. And as he sat pondering this, and pondering the curse, and pondering the fact that he needed to return in 3 days, Sir Gawain, his dearest friend, looked across the room and saw his friend, and went over and sat next to him and said, what seems to be the trouble? King Arthur thought long and hard, and decided he would tell Sir Gawain. And he said, I have been charged to save some poor soul, a Black Knight, from his curse. And if this curse has come into our kingdom, then it is our curse as well. And the curse is this, that in 3 days hence, I must tell him what women want most in all the world. And my answer, our answer, must be correct in order to lift this curse from our land. And again, my fair Gawain, this is not his curse or my curse, it is our curse, because it is among us. And I don't know the answer, do you? And Sir Gawain said, I don't, but I do know what I have. And I have the Knights of the Round Table. And I have the fairest king in all the land of my friend. Let us do this. I propose that before the sun even rises on the morrow, we send in each direction knights to the north with a scribe, knights to the east with a scribe, knights to the west with a scribe, knights to the south with a scribe, and they spend all the day and come back before sunset, and the scribe writes down every answer that every woman gives as to what women want most in all the world. And then at night, before we sleep, we will go through every answer, and surely somehow we will know what the right answer is. Now this is an interesting part of the story, because the people that are now about to figure out what women want most in all the world are all the men. And the women in this story are about to tell them some things. But the important part of the story is how able are they to listen? How able are they to know what it is that is the right answer? Well, King Arthur listens, and he's weary. And indeed, Sir Gawain is doing his best. And so they make this agreement, and they gather the knights around the fire, and they tell them what's about to happen. The knights go to bed, and sure enough, before the sun is even a crack in the purple sky, the knights came down weary and gathered their scribes, and scrolls of paper and bottles of ink are loaded into sacks and carried out in front of the castle, where the horses had been brought from the stable. The horses are weary, and in the early morning chill, the steam from their noses rises like curls, and they paw their hooves on the cobblestones, and the wet leaves are still clinging to the grass. And one scribe holds out his compass, and he points. And some of the knights go north, towards the rising stars. Some of the knights go to the west. And some of the knights walk into the morning sun, and some go south. And they begin to ask. The knights that walked into the fields asked the women who were busy pulling corn, "Excuse me, madam, what do women want most in all the world?" Women want men who can carry the heavy corn. Women want men who will help rock their babies to sleep. Women want men who will help them remember their youth. And the women in the north, what do women want most in all the world? Women want men who keep them warm at night. Women want men who will keep the fires going when we are weary. Women want men who will listen. And they nodded, and they wrote every answer down. And they went to the west. Women of the west, what do women want most? Women want men that can throw a clay pot. Women want men that will clean up the mess. Women want men. Women want men who will let them sleep when they are tired. And they wrote every answer down. And they went to the south. What do women want most? Women want men who will dance and sing. Women want men who will laugh and tell stories when all is lost. Women want men who love the feel of their own sweat. And they nodded, and they wrote each of these answers down. And the day grew long, and they paused and ate their bread and their cheese and their plowman's lunch, and they rode on their horses, and every scribe wrote every answer down. And when they felt as though their scrolls were full and their bones were weary, they turned back, each in their own direction, back to Camelot. And just as the sun dipped below the horizon, these weary horses were taken back to the stables and brushed down, their saddles covered with sweat lifted off, the barn smelling like sweat and hay, and the horses dozing, and the men were served their dinner, and the fires were brought up, and the scrolls were laid out. And they called out answer after answer after answer, and the men would say, "Yea, nay, yea, yea, nay," until they had narrowed it down to just 12 answers. And King Arthur sat again in the shadows, just by the big fire, listening, his curls dancing in the firelight, and Sir Gawain next to him. What answer do you choose? What answer will you take to him? And King Arthur thought to himself, and he said, "Sir Gawain, my dearest friend, none of these answers echoes in my heart. When I look into my true love's eyes, none of these answers are what I think she might tell me if she could find the words. Good night." And he went to bed. And soon all the weary knights that had traveled all day laid their heads upon the scrolls, and the scrolls curled up as the fire went out and the night cooled in the great hall. And before the sun rose, King Arthur came down the great staircase, slipped outside without his armor, without his spear, rode his horse out into the woods. Some say he was praying, some say he was listening to the leaves to tell him the answer, and some say he was getting ready for his death. And as he rode, he heard something. He heard something he thought was the sound of a hawk. He thought it was a hawk, and then he saw there were no hawks. And he listened, and he rode further, and he realized his horse could hear it too. Oh, what a beautiful morning! His horse had his ears back, and he slid off his horse, and he decided, now he sit down, Tosh, come sit. Because let me tell you what he decided to do. He decided to walk towards the sea, and there in front of him he saw a woman sitting on a stone wall. He stayed behind a tree, and he watched. And she sat on the stone wall with a full shirt, a full chemise, and one breast seemed to be so large as to sit next to her on the stone wall on this side. Can you believe that? And the other breast sat on the other side. And she rocked back and forth, and her breast stabilized her, and she leaned back, and she laughed, and she ran her fingers through her hair, and he decided to approach her, Don. He approached her, and she stopped, and he knelt with such graciousness in front of her, and he introduced himself. And as she put her hand out, and he moved to kiss the back of her hand, he did realize, although he showed no expression, that her fingernails grew within to her flesh and back out again, and that in fact some fingernails even had tiny snails that had taken up lodging, and one fingernail had an insect that left that cavern and crawled back up towards her wrist. And at that point he put her hand down and sat next to her, away from the breast so as not to sit upon it, and asked her about her day, and asked her what she was doing there, and she explained to him that she was waiting on her brother, who had been offered a curse, and that until he had the answer to a question of what women want most in all the world, she was doomed to sit on this wall and just simply enjoy the beauty of the day. And he said, "Fair woman, what will lift you from this curse?" And she said, "Well, there are two things that will lift me from this curse. The answer to this question. Do you think men will be able to find the answer to that question, King Arthur? What do you think? What do you think? Do you think that men will be able to find the answer to that question?" You say no? King Arthur began to wonder that himself, and she laughed. And when she laughed, spittle flew from her teeth, and she caught the spittle and used it to pull her hair back just yet again. And then she said, "Or I could share the answer, but I could only share the answer if someone marries me for true love, and I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon." And she pulled her hair back, and she said, "Oh," and she began to sing. King Arthur decided it was best to take his leave. The morning sun was getting hot. The dew was drying on the grass, and he needed to be sending his knights back out into the field to find the answer to this curse. And so he bid her goodbye and kissed her hand, just like that, and went back to the castle. And as he went into the great room, the men were making ready and rolling up their scrolls and filling their inkwells and getting ready to go. And Sir Gawain saw King Arthur and saw that he'd been up since before the sun. And he said, my king, how fare you? Where have you been?" And so King Arthur pulled him to the side and told him about this woman that he'd met, and told him that this woman knew that an answer needed to be found. And Sir Gawain was so excited. He said, tell me. And he said, "Sir Gawain, I would not wish this upon anyone." And he told Sir Gawain about her fingernails and the insects living in her hair, and her long teeth that had created furrows of spittle in the sides of her mouth. And he said, only if she marries for true love can she give us the answer to this. And Sir Gawain, what do you think Sir Gawain said? Given that he is Sir Gawain. Taj, what do you think? He said, that's right, he said, "I will go. I am your friend." And King Arthur protested. How could he allow the fair Sir Gawain, wanted by every beautiful woman in the land, to marry her? Sir Gawain was gone in a heartbeat, out before the other knights, on to his horse, riding towards the forest, hoping against all hope that she was still there. And he listened. Was that the sound of a hawk? Was it? No. Was that the sound of a rabbit in the brush? No. Was that the sound of singing? Yes. And he slid off his horse and quietly moved through the woods towards the singing until he too could observe her from the side. She was fair. Her song was fair. Her heart was fair. As she sat and she sang to the birds and she looked at the sky, Sir Gawain found a way to love her, and moved with grace towards her and across the stream and strode towards her and bent on one knee and introduced himself. And they sat there underneath the bluing sky with bluebirds. And Sir Gawain's dog found a bone and sat down content in the grass. And Sir Gawain found a way to sit contentedly next to her, and he asked her about her life, and he asked her what made her happy, and he asked her what made her sad, and he asked her about her dreams. And when he had found a path to loving her, he knelt on one knee, and he said, I would have you for my wife, for I have found a way to love you. And she was speechless, and she held out her hand. And some say in that moment, that hand with gnarled fingernails became beautiful and white as snow. And some say that's just a fairy tale. But they made an agreement that Sir Gawain would go back to the city and make ready for a great wedding, and that she would prepare herself, and before sunset she would come back. She would ride through the streets, and she would come back to the city, and she would marry Sir Gawain. And in fact, Sir Gawain kissed her hand, rode back, and said to all the maidens and all the knights that were returning from their journeys and their questioning, question no more, for I am marrying this night as the sun sets. And they brought in young green trees, and the carpenter set to making a platform in front of the castle. And all the maidens put on their finery, and they got out their kerchiefs that smelled like perfume to hide their tears, because each of them had wished that they would be the one to marry Sir Gawain, and now he was marrying someone else. They were curious, and they lined the street of Camelot that led to the palace. And the platform for the wedding was made with green trees and ribbons and finery. And just as the sun began to set and shoot down the street of cobblestones and white houses, and all the maidens came out in their pinks and blues and purples with their pointy hats and their veils waving in the sunset, King Arthur came out and stood on the platform, and he had a sun emblazoned on his armor, which caught the sunlight and shone, and everyone could feel that he was their king. And then Guinevere came out and stood next, and everyone knew that she was their goddess, their queen. And then the fair Sir Gawain in green armor, covered in leaves, with tiny faces hidden, stepped out into the sunset golden light, and they all looked forward, and all the maids and all the men looked up to the other end of the street. And there she was. She had one breast hanging in this side saddle, and the other breast hung in this side saddle, and her chemise was open, and the breast swung openly, and her hair flew back, and insects flew about her head, and when she rode by on the horse, the women took their handkerchiefs and put them in front of their nose because she smelled so bad, and then some of the women walked. Sir Gawain was marrying her, and she rode past them all, and she nodded, and she rode up to the marriage platform and slid off the horse and said, "Whoa!" and grabbed that other breast and tucked it back in, and climbed up onto the marriage platform, and with the sun setting, her hand was put in the hand of Gawain, and King Arthur declared them married, and King Arthur, seeing the faces of his people, said, "And everyone's invited to the wedding feast." And the hope was that if people could party and drink and dance all night long. Sir Gawain would never have to go to bed with her. So even when people were getting ready to fall asleep on their arm, they would wake up and they would remember Sir Gawain and they would party again. But finally, deep into the night, Sir Gawain rose, scooted the bench back. Everyone got quiet. Put his hand out. There she was. He said, "My ladies, my gentlemen, it is time for me to go to the marriage bed of my fair lady. I bid you good night." Everyone froze, and off he went. Oh my God. No one knew what to do, and they were quiet. They waited for screams. They waited for tears. But nothing was heard, Taj, except for the sound of the doors closing. They went into a room with a bed, candles by the side, candles in the four corners of the room, and Sir Gawain immediately went to the left. And this fair woman went to the right and stood in front of a mirror, and Sir Gawain kept his back to her and began to light candles, and he said, "Milady, I honor that you do not know me and that I do not know you. And until such time as you tell me that you are ready to bed with me, we will not bed." And as he lit the candles, and he said this to her, I want to tell you something. Are you paying attention? The candles seemed to brighten a bit. The room seemed to glow a bit more. And some say that didn't happen, but this is a fairy tale, and I tell you it may have happened. Because as he lit some of the last candles and turned around, he saw a different woman. He saw a woman with combed hair, long and all the way down to the floor. He saw a woman with fair, clean skin and rosy cheek and clear eye. He saw a woman of healthy form in a glowing room, still dim but warm. And she said to him, "Come to me, Sir Gawain, for you are fair. You are the fair Sir Gawain, and I have something to tell you." And he knelt in front of her and took her hands, and she looked down upon him and she said to him, "I have been under a curse, as has my brother. And the curse was for me to find the answer of what women want most in all the world, and I believe in your statement to me that I choose when we make love. I believe that in your heart I find my path, and together we find the answer. And so I tell you, Sir Gawain, you may have me fair of face by day and foul by night, if this is what you choose. Or you may have me foul by day, but fair by night, so that we may bed and have joy out of mind. What would you have?" And he took her hands and he said, "That is not for me to decide, that is for you to decide." And those candles, which had already been brightened 100-fold, and the room glowed in a way that was 1,000 suns. And she said, "In your answer the spell is broken, for you have granted what women want most in all the world, which is sovereignty over themselves." And he stood and scooped her in his arms and bent her back, and it said they made joy out of mind until every candle burnt down and they slept. And when the morning came, all the people weeping in their drunkenness in the lower hall began to creep up the stairs, and the doors to the bedchamber were opened, and there they saw Sir Gawain, ruddy of cheek, sitting up next to his new bride, who did not look like the bride they saw before. And they rose from the bed, and a merry breakfast was had. And in all the kingdom the bees began to make honey, and the goats began to make milk, and the goats were seen to dance in the corners of the meadow when no one was looking. And King Arthur slid gently upon his horse, and turned away from the merriment, and found his way by smelling the smoke back to the little island. and he climbed up onto the island, where the Black Knight greeted him with a sword to the ground. And King Arthur simply looked through those slits in the black armor, and he said, "What women want most in all the world is sovereignty over themselves." Pooh! Just like that, the Black Knight turned into black smoke and disappeared. The sword turned to ash, and the fire only smoked. And King Arthur looked at the sky, and looked at the beautiful forest, and waded back across the stream, and got back on his horse, and rode back to where the merriment was taking place, and joined in the dance. And that is the story of Dame Ragnell, and what women want most in all the world. And I hope you liked your story.